One of the confusing things about motivation is that oftentimes we kind of know exactly what we need to do, but we can't seem to bring ourselves to do it. And this is sort of the quintessential motivational struggle that people have, right? I know what's good for me. I know I should eat healthier. I know I should wake up earlier. I know I should exercise more. I know I should work on my resume. I know I should do all these things, but I can't bring myself to do it. And so what we sort of think of is we think oh my God, I need motivation. I need to find more motivation. I lack motivation. But this is something that I'd really like to dig into, because I think part of the reason that this is so hard to fix is because we actually misdiagnose the problem. So as an addiction psychiatrist, I work with a lot of people who really want to make changes in their lives. And so, for example, if you're addicted to a substance, so for example, one time I had a patient who was addicted to heroin, and the heroin was just ruining every part of their life. So they were, running into trouble with work, they were missing work, they were sort of getting put on probation, they had legal trouble, there was a lot of financial stress because they were spending a lot of money buying drugs. From a relationship standpoint, they were also running into a lot of trouble, on the brink of divorce because of their substance use. And so as I was working with this person, I was kind of really shocked because despite all of these reasons to quit, they just weren't able to. And at the very beginning, I used to think oh, this is just because they're addicted, right? This is just something that's in their brain. It's not anything more complicated than that. This is just a biological addiction that, they just sort of drew the short straw in life. Their brain was wired a certain way. They inherited some kind of gene, and it's essentially not their fault. The challenge there is that what do you do about that, right? If we sort of determine that motivation is something that's completely out of our control, especially in the realm of addiction, how do we fix that? Because this person was coming into my office week after week and they were saying, I need to quit, I need to quit, and I need to quit. But they just weren't able to do it. And so this is sort of what we see, right? We have a lot of people out there, and it's not just drug addiction, it's all kinds of stuff with our life that we know we should do. We know we should do more stuff. But what we tell ourselves is that we're not motivated. And so as we sort of tell ourselves, okay, I'm not motivated, I lack motivation, what we have is a whole wave of people giving us answers, right? We have this whole self-help industry that is born out of our problem of a lack of motivation. And so we have all these different books, and we have all these different self-help gurus, and then we have all these brain hacks and life hacks and motivation hacks. And despite the fact that we have all of these resources and there's so much hacking going on of every aspect of who we are, gene hacks, supplement hacks, despite all of these things, our motivation doesn't actually increase, right? Despite all of these resources, if you go outside, what do you hear people complaining about? They're still complaining about a lack of motivation. They're still complaining about things like burnout, and they can't bring themselves to do something. So none of this stuff seems to be working. And so what's going on there? It turns out that this is not really a problem of a lack of motivation. And the reason that all of these solutions don't work is because they're treating the wrong problem. And the essence of it isn't that we lack motivation, but that we're actually very, very highly motivated, just in the wrong direction. So going back to my patient who is addicted to heroin, as I started to get to know them better and as we started to work on this, we made a couple of really interesting discoveries. So I kind of asked them, week after week, we kind of revisit this topic of why do you do this, man? It's ruining every part of your life. And it seems that the worse your life gets, the more you start to use. Despite the fact that the consequences are getting worse and worse, and it's becoming more and more important for you to quit, it seems like you're using more and more. And the way that we think about it, we think, okay, if something is really important to me, then I'm more motivated towards it, right? The bigger the consequence, the more my motivation is. But sometimes it's actually kind of the opposite. And especially with addiction, this seemed to be the case. And so one day we sort of had this really kind of important aha moment. We kind of had this breakthrough where he sort of explained to me, and he's like, as my life gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, I spend all day, every day in this absolute mess that is my life. My ex is calling me, I have to go to court to do custody stuff. I'm on probation at work because of this kind of thing. Every day when I get home from work and then I've had to spend the morning in court, I go to work and then I get home and there's a pile of bills on the table. that I can't afford because I've spent so much money on drugs. And then all I've got is like one escape, right? There's one thing that I can do that can make all of the problems in my life go away for just a few hours. And that's when we sort of made this big breakthrough that we were conceptualizing this problem wrong. It's not that this person had a lack of motivation. It's that they were so motivated towards, in a sense, fixing their problems. Because while they're high, none of their problems actually exist. And of course they want all of their problems to go away. The only problem is that they've got one really, really easy way to make all of their problems disappear for a few hours at a time. Sometimes when we have a goal that we really, really want, and we say to ourselves, this is important to me, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this, and we scratch our heads about why we aren't motivated, it turns out that there's something holding us back. And this isn't just true of things like drug addiction, it can also matter for all kinds of smaller things, like eating a little bit healthier or getting in shape or spending less time on screens, spending more time outdoors, learning a new skill. There are all kinds of different things that we wish we would do. But when we start to try to do them, we sort of perceive a lack of motivation. But it's not a lack of motivation, there's actually something else in the way. And that's what I call resistance. And resistance is sort of that which gets in the way of what you know you should do. And there are two major areas, two major sources of resistance, and we're going to kind of dive into one right now, which are emotions. So the first thing to understand about emotions is that the influence of emotions on behavior is way stronger than logic or analytical reasoning. And this is like kind of weird when we sort of think about it, because most of us think to ourselves, if this is logical, why don't I do it, right? There's a lot of stuff logically we know we should do. But just the fact that logic doesn't shape behavior, for example, you can go to someone who smokes cigarettes and you can say, well, logically, if you smoke cigarettes, it's going to cost you money, you're going to have like lung problems, and you could get lung cancer, and you could have heart disease. Logically, shouldn't you stop smoking? And people are like, yeah, obviously I should stop smoking. But it doesn't actually get them to quit smoking. So we can use logic as much as we want to think ourselves into doing something, but the truth of the matter is that's not actually going to motivate our behavior. What motivates our behavior are actually emotions. And this also kind of correlates with our brain. So you can sort of see this in our neuroanatomy, where the centers of our brain that govern emotion are very, very tightly connected to the centers of our brain that sort of manage learning, as well as sort of like behavioral control and motivation. Thinking and logic comes from sort of the cerebral cortices, which are the higher order parts of our brain. They're sort of at the top or the outside of our brain. But a lot of our emotional circuitry is like right in the middle of our brain, next to where we learn and next to where we sort of get motivated towards action. So emotions are very powerful motivators towards our behavior. And this is really important to understand because we can logically know that we need to do something, but that doesn't naturally drive our behavior. What drives our behavior are emotions. And we see that represented like in media and in movies. Whenever you watch a movie about someone having this transformative experience, it's not like a transformative experience through Googling things and reading Wikipedia for like 4 hours, right? It's a transformative experience that's emotional in nature. And if you think about movies that you really enjoy, there are these powerful, transformative emotional experiences. That one moment where your fellow soldier died in your arms and then you vowed to take revenge. Or, all of these other things, these like really powerful emotional moments that drive change within us, that catalyze a change in motivation and sort of drive our behavior forward. And this actually maps onto our brain very, very well. The amygdala is our fear center and our survival center, and is a very, very powerful controller of our behavior as well as learning. So if we look at the parts of our brain that actually learn, they're very tightly connected, like the hippocampus is very tightly connected to our amygdala. And so what we sort of discover there is that emotions are powerful ways in which we learn and change behavior. And if we're thinking about motivation, what's the goal of motivation? It's to alter our behavior. And so what people need to understand about emotions is that they're kind of like the override switch for behavior. Even if we kind of know logically that we should do something, if there's kind of an emotional activation, if the amygdala kind of activates at a particular time, it sort of overrides any kind of logic. A really good example of this is people who perform. So if I spend 3 months learning to play a particular piece on the piano, and I practice it day in and day out and day in and day out until I master the piece, I'm 100% sure that I can play this piece. I can play it in my sleep. I've been playing it for hours a day, every day for the last 3 months. Everything's super easy. I know how to play the piece. I can teach other people how to play the piece. I can play it in my sleep. I can play it with my eyes closed. I've memorized the whole thing. And what happens when you go up on stage, right? You can play it at home. You played it at home 3 times an hour ago. You played it backstage right before you came up on stage. What happens when you go up on stage? It becomes really hard to play. And so what do you feel in that moment? What makes you, despite the fact that you've been motivated for the last 3 months to learn this piece and you've been practicing it every day, where does that motivation go the second that you walk on stage, or even before you walk on stage? As you're waiting backstage and you're ready to walk on stage, what do you actually feel? That emotional override switch kicks in. And so this is something that's really important to understand, is that emotions are kind of very powerful controllers of our behavior. But the tricky thing is, when we come to a lack of motivation, it doesn't really feel like that, right? We don't necessarily feel a huge emotional blockage or some kind of last-minute panic right before we go on stage. Our experience of a lack of motivation is usually kind of emotionally neutral. So just to give you all kind of an example, so if I wake up one day and I sort of decide that I really should be eating healthy, I don't really get this powerful emotional pull, oh my God, like you're gonna panic, or some amount of fear or anxiety. That's not what I feel. But something really interesting happens if you really tunnel down into it. When you feel a lack of motivation, what you end up usually doing is distracting yourself. So if I say to myself, okay, I wanna wake up today and I wanna go to the gym, and then like as I'm sort of thinking about going to the gym, I'll end up sort of slipping into my phone, or I'll start watching something. I'll do something to kind of distract myself. It's not like I just sit there and like think about going to the gym and don't go to the gym. There's this really important piece that you really need to tunnel down into, which is like that we evoke some amount of distraction. And if you look at it from a neuroscientific perspective, why do we evoke distractions? Why do we engage in distractions? What are we trying to distract ourselves from? And that's where what most people have actually learned is that that distracting component is to distract yourself from the emotion to begin with. And that's exactly why we don't feel it, right? Because as I'm struggling to go to the gym, if I really stop and let myself sit there in that moment, what I'll do is feel a lot of negative emotions. Frustration will come up, maybe some amount of shame, some amount of like, I can't believe like I can't do this, right? What's wrong with me? There's all kinds of negative stuff that could come up if we let it. But our brain has learned how to protect us from all of that. And what we end up doing is slipping into distraction. So oddly enough, if you find yourself with a lack of motivation, and you find yourself sort of engaging in distraction anytime you try to do something, the missing link there is kind of a subsurface emotion. So let's take a look at some examples where this could be at play. So I once had a student who was procrastinating to send an email to their professor asking for an extension. The student had a project that had a deadline and they weren't going to make that deadline. And they had a good relationship with their professor, and their professor was a nice person. So all they had to do was send an email to their professor. It's simple, right? It's like a 3-line email. It takes less than 30 seconds. Hey, professor, I'm sorry, but I've really had a lot of trouble recently. I got COVID, and my cat has also been sick. Can I get a 1-week extension on this project? That's all they had to do. A really simple thing, right? And yet, despite the fact that it's a simple thing, despite the fact that they had a good excuse, despite all of these logical reasons, they know the professor knows that they're a good student, it's so simple, just send the email, it's so easy. They struggled to do it. I just can't send it. I just can't send it. I don't know why, I just can't send it. It's so easy to do, it's so easy to do. And so the more that you tunnel down into it, the more we realize that there are all of these subsurface emotions. And that anytime they thought about sending the email, they would sit down at their computer, they'd open up a draft of the email, and something would happen lightning fast. And they'd feel very, very like panicked for a brief second, and then they'd open up a video game. And they'd distract themselves. They'd open up Netflix and start watching something. They'd open up some kind of like their Twitter feed, right? And then they disappear for an hour or two, the day goes by, the next day they wake up, oh, I need to send that email. And then once again, the distraction. So what's the emotion there? What's going on? It turns out that there are a ton of emotions there. And the stronger the emotions, the stronger the lack of motivation. So they were ashamed of themselves, right? Because at the end of the day, a lot of students got COVID, and a lot of them are going to turn their projects in on time. At the end of the day, it's not just the COVID. If they had actually done a good job and be diligent, they could have turned in the project on time. They actually had enough time. 1 week was enough because they were sort of procrastinating anyway. They were also ashamed of what their professor would think of them because they did have a good relationship with the professor. The professor knew that they were competent and hardworking, and they didn't want to be the student that asks for an extension. Because who are the students that ask for extensions? They're the lazy students. They're the students who can't manage their time. They're the students who aren't smart or aren't hardworking. So for this person, sending that email came with so many different emotional attachments. All of these kinds of emotions, the shame, the fear, and also, by the way, the paralyzing fear of what if the professor said no, right? And the panic that induces because now I've only got 4 days left for the project. The professor said no, and now I have to scramble to do it. The fear of that coming to pass was so powerful. And so this was kind of an example of some really simple task with sort of a lack of motivation or some kind of procrastination that ended up actually being emotional in nature. So we also see this in cases of romantic relationships, where sometimes we have things in our past that we're not exactly proud of. And we sort of know that it's okay to make mistakes in relationships, and we learn from them and we grow from them, and then we meet new people and we form healthy relationships. And this person loves me, I love them, everything's great, we have a trusting relationship, and we all know that communication is the foundation of trust, and communication is the foundation of a relationship. And we know that in the past, what happened to me isn't my fault. And yet, it's so hard to tell our partner. Even though we have so many reasons to trust them, even though we know that they love us, that actually paradoxically makes it harder. All of the things that logically reassure us in terms of having that conversation, emotionally, there's that override switch. And we're paralyzed by fear of rejection. What if this person breaks up with me after I tell them? Even if it's in the past, there's always a possibility, right? There's a possibility that they'll reject me because we carry that shame with us. And when we carry shame with us, we're always afraid that people will treat us the way that we think about ourselves, even if we know logically that it isn't true. And we also see this in situations at work. So oftentimes we'll experience some amount of imposter syndrome, right? So where we'll go to work and we got hired for the job. There was a very thorough interview process. We had a very strong resume. They checked our references. They asked us, are you capable of doing A, B, C, and D? And we said, yes, I'm capable of it. I've done it in the past. I'm confident in it. And they hire you. And then you show up at work and it's really hard to open your mouth in a meeting, right? You know that you kind of got there for a reason. Logically, you deserve to be there. But every time you open your mouth, what happens is you're afraid. What if they figure out that you actually don't belong here? What if you say something that reveals to everyone else that you're actually an imposter and that you've been faking it and you're not nearly as competent as everyone else here and you're not nearly as competent as you pretend to be? So even though logically you should speak up in the meeting, and this is something that I've sort of seen with patients where they'll come to me and they'll say, I can't bring myself to speak up in a meeting. I really need to. I need to advocate for myself. I've done a really good job. I deserve the credit. When people ask me what's going on at work, I have wins to share, but it becomes really, really hard to share those wins. And what does that come down to? Once again, it comes down to an emotion. It comes down to that emotional override switch where when we want to do something, this pile of emotion stands in the way. What if they figure out, oh my God, what if I say the wrong thing? What if the CEO listens to me and realizes that I'm an idiot and says to me that you're fired? And the whole point is that that's irrational, right? We know it's irrational. And then we beat ourselves up because we're like, it's an irrational fear. But that's sort of like, that's the nature of emotions, right? All emotions by definition are not rational. The rational parts of our brain, our cerebral cortices, are completely different from our limbic system and amygdala. Where they kind of come from, the conclusions that they come to are by definition emotional. And the thing is, all of these things are possibilities. We know that this could happen, right? Logically, we know that if I share something from a past relationship with my current partner, the partner could break up with me. You never know. It's possible, but it's not very likely. The challenge is that even though things may be in our favor from a logical perspective, from a probability perspective, even if we tell ourselves that I should be able to do this, it's really important to me, I care about this a lot, something gets in the way. When we struggle with motivation, we think to ourselves, okay, I really want to be motivated towards this. But the interesting thing is that our motivation is pointed in a different way. Our motivation is giving in to that emotion. What it's really doing is protecting us from that emotion becoming a reality. Because even if I practiced for 3 months to play this piece on stage, what if I screw up? What if I forget? What if I miss a note? And when we stand on stage so we're about to go on stage, that emotional override switch activates and motivates us to stay back there. It tells us, hey, as long as you don't go on stage, you'll be safe, right? People will be disappointed. Yeah, of course. But there's a difference between people being vaguely disappointed and you being on stage and then you making a mistake and everyone kind of holding their breath because everyone sees you screwing up. Another really tricky way that this emotional resistance manifests is actually, I'm tired. This is one of the guiltiest culprits for emotional resistance, where if we sort of think about it, okay, it's not just motivation, it's oh, I'm tired. But if you tunnel down into what is that? What is the experience of being tired? And as you tell someone, okay, I'm tired, but being tired doesn't really mean you can't do something, right? You can still go to the gym if you're tired. You can still send an email to your professor if you're tired. Tired doesn't actually negatively impact our function very much, and we sort of know that because we do all kinds of crap when we're tired. We stay up till 4 in the morning when we're exhausted at 10 p.m. The human body is capable of doing all kinds of stuff when we're tired. The key question is, when does being tired keep you from doing something? And if it keeps you from doing something, that's a clue that the tiredness could be the umbrella or could be sort of the camouflage for the emotional resistance underneath. So oddly enough, I know it sounds kind of strange, but if you find yourself to be lacking motivation, what you really needed to look at is what's the resistance at work here? What's getting in the way of your motivation? And the tricky thing about that is that you may not feel a very powerful emotion right at the get-go. It won't necessarily be like that situation where you're about to go on stage. Instead, chances are what's going to happen is as that emotion starts to rise up, your mind tries to protect you from it by engaging in a distraction. And we know there's numerous fMRI studies which look at it's a functional imaging study of the brain, which look at blood flow to the emotional centers of our brain. And when we engage in distracting activities, we actually reduce the blood flow to our negative emotional circuitry within the brain. So if you're someone who kind of goes into these situations where you logically should do something, but you can't bring yourself to do it, and you wind up distracting yourself with something else, the answer could be that emotional resistance. And we'll teach you a little bit more about how to unpack what that is and how to dig into it.